By the time anyone realized what was happening, 4 of them were already dead. The 5th, a boy of 9, lay shaking on the cold stone floor, whispering one word to the doctor who arrived too late: her. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret Ellery had walked through the gates of Ashcombe Hall carrying a single suitcase and a letter of recommendation nobody thought to question. She was quiet, polite, and exactly what the Whitmore family needed: a governess to teach their 3 children while Lord and Lady Whitmore entertained guests and managed their estate. The children liked her immediately. She told stories at bedtime, corrected their manners gently, and never once raised her voice. Even the strict old housekeeper admitted, grudgingly, that the new governess had a way of calming a restless house. The staff found her pleasant, if a little distant. Nobody noticed how carefully she watched the family at dinner. Nobody noticed how she memorized who took sugar, who avoided wine, who always finished their soup first, and who left half a plate untouched. By the 2nd week, she had learned everyone's habits perfectly, down to the minute each of them fell asleep. On a quiet Tuesday evening, the family gathered for dinner as they always did. Margaret sat with them, as she often did now, having become something like family herself. The soup was served. The wine was poured. Laughter filled the dining hall, warm and unaware. Within the hour, 3 of them were dead. By morning, a 4th had followed, and the house that had rung with laughter the night before fell into a silence no one there would ever forget. Only the youngest boy survived, barely, and when he was well enough to speak, days later, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said only her name. To understand why Margaret Ellery did what she did, you have to go back further, to a small village 60 miles from Ashcombe Hall, where she had been born under a different name entirely. She was the daughter of a chemist, a man who taught her which plants healed and which plants killed before she was old enough to understand the difference. Her mother died young, and for a few years it was just Margaret and her father, bent over jars of dried leaves and bottles of tinctures in a small back room that smelled of bitter herbs. Then her father remarried, and everything changed. His new wife had no patience for a clever, watchful girl who asked too many questions and remembered too much. By 16, Margaret had left home with nothing but her father's notebook of remedies and poisons hidden in her belongings, along with a quiet resolve never to be powerless again. She worked as a maid first, then a nanny, moving from household to household under different names, never staying long enough to be truly known. She was skilled at appearing ordinary. She smiled when expected. She curtsied when required. And in every house she worked, small things went missing: money, jewelry, sometimes nothing at all except peace of mind, as arguments broke out between husbands and wives for reasons no one could quite explain. Nobody ever suspected the quiet governess in the corner refilling teacups. When she arrived at Ashcombe Hall, she carried letters of recommendation from families who, if anyone had bothered to check, no longer existed. The Whitmores never checked. Why would they? Margaret was polished, well-spoken, and came so highly praised. What the Whitmores didn't know was that Margaret had chosen them carefully, for the fortune, the jewels, and a will that, under the right circumstances, could be changed. For a while, everything at Ashcombe Hall seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. The eldest daughter, Charlotte, 16 and sharper than her parents gave her credit for, began to notice things, small things. The way Margaret always insisted on preparing the evening tea herself, dismissing the kitchen staff to save them the trouble. The way she asked questions about the family's finances that seemed too specific for a governess's curiosity. Questions about the estate, the will, who would inherit what and when. Charlotte mentioned it once to her mother, who laughed it off gently. "She's simply thorough, darling. That's why we hired her." But Charlotte kept watching, quietly, the way her mother never had. She noticed that whenever Margaret served her father his tea, he grew tired earlier than usual, complaining of headaches that vanished by morning as if they'd never happened. She noticed a small tin hidden at the back of Margaret's wardrobe, one she wasn't supposed to see, containing dried herbs Charlotte didn't recognize, and a faint, bitter smell she couldn't place. One evening, driven by an unease she couldn't fully explain even to herself, Charlotte sat at her writing desk and began a letter to her aunt in London, describing her suspicions in careful detail and asking her to look into the governess's background before anyone else was hurt. She never got the chance to send it. Margaret found the letter first, tucked beneath a stack of Charlotte's schoolbooks. That night, for the first time, Margaret's calm expression cracked, just slightly, just for a moment, as she read Charlotte's careful, worried handwriting by candlelight. She had been so patient, so careful, and now a 16-year-old girl had nearly undone everything with nothing but instinct and a letter. Margaret made a decision. The timeline would have to move faster than planned. The family had 1 week left, though none of them knew it yet. Margaret spent the final week playing the role of the perfect governess more convincingly than ever. She helped Charlotte with her music lessons, praising her progress warmly. She read stories to the younger children each night, her voice as soft and steady as ever. She smiled at Lord and Lady Whitmore across the dinner table, laughing at their small jokes, all while measuring exact doses in her mind with the same care her father once used to measure medicine. She couldn't poison them all at once. That would be too obvious, too fast, too easily traced back to a single meal. Instead, she'd built it up over weeks, tiny doses hidden in tea and soup that slowly weakened their bodies, disguised as a passing illness moving quietly through the household. A cough here, a fever there, nothing alarming on its own. By the final dinner, their systems were already fragile, worn thin without anyone realizing why. It would only take one last push. She chose a Tuesday, when the cook took her half-day off, and Margaret would be trusted to help prepare the meal herself, just as she'd planned weeks in advance. The soup was rich with herbs that night, herbs that masked the taste of something far more dangerous underneath. Margaret sat with the family as she always did, eating a small, carefully avoided portion of her own plate, and watched. Lord Whitmore was the first to complain of dizziness, then Lady Whitmore, gripping the table's edge, then Charlotte, who managed to whisper the tea before she collapsed, a detail investigators would later fail to understand, since it was the soup, not the tea, that finally finished what weeks of doses had started. Only young Thomas, the 9-year-old, had eaten little that night, distracted by a toy under the table. It saved his life, though barely. By the time the staff realized something was wrong, Margaret had already begun packing. Thomas Whitmore survived, but barely, and it would be years before doctors understood why his small body had resisted what killed the rest of his family. Perhaps simply because he'd eaten so little that final night, too distracted by a toy to notice the danger on his plate. Margaret Ellery vanished that night, slipping away from Ashcombe Hall before the first search parties were organized, leaving behind no trace of her real name, no clue to where she'd come from, and no explanation beyond a half-emptied tin of dried herbs investigators couldn't immediately identify. For months, the case baffled authorities. The Whitmore fortune sat frozen, tied up in a will that named no clear next of kin now that 4 family members were dead. It was, investigators eventually realized, exactly the outcome someone might want if they'd intended to make a claim through forged documents once the dust had settled and suspicion had faded. But Margaret never returned to collect anything. Whether she lost her nerve, feared discovery, or simply moved on to another family in another town under yet another borrowed name, no one ever learned. Thomas grew up haunted by fragments, a woman's calm voice reading bedtime stories, the smell of a particular tea, a face he could never quite picture clearly no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many nights he lay awake trying. He spent much of his adult life searching for her, hiring investigators, chasing rumors of women matching her description in towns across the country, each lead colder than the last. Then, nearly 15 years after that final dinner at Ashcombe Hall, Thomas found something that changed everything. Buried in an old provincial newspaper archive, he came across a brief report from a town 3 counties away. A wealthy family of 4, dead within a single night. A governess who had vanished before the bodies were even cold. The details were too precise to be coincidence. The tea service, the sudden illness disguised as passing sickness, the letters of recommendation from families no one could locate. It was her. He was certain of it. But the report was decades old, the trail long since gone cold, and the woman in question had vanished just as completely as she had from Ashcombe Hall. He never found her. Some say Margaret Ellery died quietly under yet another false name, an old woman with a past no one ever uncovered. Others believe she simply became very good at disappearing, perhaps still out there, still watching families at dinner tables, still learning who takes sugar and who finishes their soup first. The Whitmore case was officially closed, unsolved, within 2 years. If this story kept you on edge, that's exactly why we tell it. Every case we bring you is built the same way. Quiet details hiding something far darker underneath. If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you've got a theory about what really happened to Margaret Ellery, drop it in the comments. We read everyone.